I learned the hard way that some battles choose you. And mine started the day Patricia Henderson knocked on my door with a clipboard and a smile that could curdle milk. My name is Grant Hughes, and I had just moved to Maplewood Springs, Colorado, a planned community nestled in the foothills about 40 miles outside Denver. The house was perfect, a 3-bedroom ranch with a detached workshop and 5 acres of mixed woodland that stretched behind my property. I had bought the place specifically for those trees. As a custom furniture maker, having my own sustainable wood source was like striking gold. The previous owner, an elderly woodworker himself, had maintained the forest beautifully, selectively harvesting mature trees and replanting regularly. It was a woodworker's paradise. I had been living there for 3 months, keeping to myself, setting up my workshop, and starting to identify which trees I would harvest first. The oak and walnut were particularly stunning. I was out marking a large black walnut that had probably been growing for 60 years when I heard footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves behind me. "Hello there, neighbor." The voice was aggressively cheerful, the kind that immediately puts you on guard. I turned to see a woman in her late 40s, wearing a pristine cream-colored pantsuit that was completely inappropriate for walking through the woods. Her blonde hair was styled in that specific way that screamed, "I need to speak to the manager," and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Patricia Henderson, HOA president." She extended her hand without coming any closer, probably worried about getting dirt on her shoes. "I wanted to officially welcome you to the community and go over some important information." I wiped the sawdust off my hand and walked over to shake hers. "Grant Hughes, nice to meet you." "I see you are inspecting the trees," she said, her eyes scanning the forest with an expression I could not quite read. "That is actually one of the things I needed to discuss with you." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What about them?" Patricia pulled out her clipboard, flipping through several pages with practiced efficiency. "Well, as you may or may not know, our community has certain standards and shared resources. The HOA has been reviewing the property records, and we have determined that your wooded area represents a valuable community asset." "Community asset," I repeated slowly. "It is on my property. I own this land." Yes, of course you do," she said with a dismissive wave that made my jaw clench. "But you have to understand, Grant, we are a community here. We share resources to maintain the high standards that make Maplewood Springs such a desirable place to live. Several of our residents have expressed interest in using wood from your property for various projects. It only makes sense to establish a sharing system." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I shook my head. "You want me to give my trees to other people, not give exactly, share. There is a difference." She smiled that smile again. "We are thinking of organizing a community woodworking program. Very rustic, very trendy. We could have workshops, classes, build some charming picnic tables for the community park. It would add so much value to the neighborhood." "With my wood," I said flatly. "With our community's wood," she corrected. "Look, I understand you are new here, so let me explain how things work. The HOA has authority over matters that affect the community's aesthetic and property values. Your forest is visible from several properties. We have a vested interest in how it is managed." "Managed by me," I said. "On my property." Patricia's smile tightened. "I would encourage you to review your HOA bylaws, Section 12, subsection D, Community Resource Allocation. I will send you a copy. We will be discussing this at the next board meeting, and we would love for you to attend." She handed me a business card. "Thursday, 7 p.m. at the community center. I really do hope you will be cooperative about this, Grant. Things go so much smoother when everyone works together." She turned and picked her way back through the woods, leaving me standing there with her business card in one hand and my tree marker in the other, feeling like I had just been politely mugged. That evening, I dug out my HOA documents. I had skimmed them when I bought the house, looking for the usual prohibitions: no RVs in driveways, no clotheslines, no chain-link fences. Standard suburban nonsense. But I had not paid much attention to the more obscure sections. Section 12, subsection D, was buried on page 47. The language was deliberately vague, talking about shared community resources and equitable distribution of neighborhood assets, without ever defining what those things meant. It referenced natural resources within the community boundaries, but did not specify whether that meant common areas or private property. The whole thing read like it had been written by a lawyer who charged by the word and measured success by how many loopholes they could create. I spent the next 2 days doing research. I called a real estate attorney who explained that HOA bylaws could be surprisingly broad, but that they generally could not supersede property rights. He cautioned me that fighting an HOA was expensive and time-consuming, and that I should try to resolve things diplomatically first. I also talked to a few neighbors, trying to get a sense of what I was dealing with. The picture that emerged was not encouraging. Patricia Henderson had been HOA president for 6 years, running unopposed after she systematically drove away anyone who disagreed with her. She had expanded the HOA's power incrementally, adding new rules and interpretations every few months. Most residents just paid their dues and avoided making waves, afraid of being targeted with endless violations and fines. The few who had fought back found themselves drowning in legal fees and petty harassment. One neighbor, an older man named Tom who lived 3 houses down, was particularly helpful. He had been around since the neighborhood was built 20 years ago. "She is something else," he told me over coffee on his back deck. "Started small, you know. Making sure everyone's grass was the right height, enforcing the paint color restrictions. But in the last few years, it has gotten worse. She sees the HOA as her personal kingdom. Had a family fined $5,000 last year because their Halloween decorations were up 2 days past the allowed date. They ended up selling and moving. Can she really claim my trees are community property?" I asked. Tom shrugged. "Who knows? The problem is not whether she is right. The problem is that she will make your life hell either way. My advice: give her a few trees, let her have her little woodworking program, and stay off her radar." I understood his logic. It was practical, sensible. But the idea of letting this woman bully me into giving away my property, my livelihood, made my blood boil. Those trees were not just lumber to me. They represented my entire business model, my reason for buying this house. I had plans for a sustainable harvest rotation that would provide me with premium hardwood for decades. I was not about to let some power-hungry HOA president turn my forest into a community craft project. Thursday evening came too quickly. I drove to the community center, a bland brick building near the neighborhood entrance, and found the meeting room. About 20 people were scattered among the folding chairs, most of them looking bored or checking their phones. Patricia sat at a table in front, flanked by 2 other board members, a thin, nervous-looking man she introduced as Trevor, the treasurer, and a heavy-set woman named Carol, who seemed to be there purely for decoration. The meeting dragged through the usual tedium. Minutes from the last meeting, financial reports, discussions about the contract for snow removal, and whether the entrance sign needed repainting. I was starting to zone out when Patricia cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "Now, I would like to discuss an exciting new initiative, she began. As some of you know, we have a new resident, Grant Hughes, who owns the lovely wooded property on Birch Lane. This represents a wonderful opportunity for our community. I sat up straighter as heads turned to look at me. Patricia continued, her voice taking on the practiced enthusiasm of a corporate presentation. I propose we establish the Maplewood Springs Community Woodworking Program. We would organize sustainable harvesting of the timber on Mr. Hughes's property, with the wood being made available for community projects. We could build new benches for the park, repair the gazebo, maybe even offer woodworking classes for residents. A few people nodded, looking mildly interested. One woman raised her hand. That sounds lovely, Patricia, very community-oriented. I am glad you think so, Linda, Patricia said warmly. Of course, we would need Mr. Hughes's cooperation. Grant, would you like to share your thoughts? All eyes turned to me. I stood up, taking a moment to gather my words. I appreciate the enthusiasm for woodworking, but I am afraid there is a fundamental problem with this proposal. Those trees are on my private property and I use them for my business. I am a professional furniture maker. That wood is not a hobby resource. It is my inventory, my raw materials. I cannot simply give it away. Patricia's smile never wavered. No one is asking you to give anything away, Grant. This would be a sharing arrangement. You would still have access to the wood, of course. How much access? I asked. If you are planning community projects and classes, that could mean dozens of people harvesting trees at random. That is not how sustainable forestry works. You need careful selection, proper timing, replanting protocols. You cannot just let people wander through with chainsaws whenever they want a piece of oak. I am sure we could work out a reasonable system, Patricia said, her tone suggesting she found my concerns trivial. The point is, these resources should benefit the entire community, not just one person. They are benefiting me because I paid for them, I said, trying to keep my voice level. The property was priced accordingly. I did not get a discount because the trees might become community property later. A man in the back raised his hand. I kind of see his point, Patricia. I mean, if someone wanted to use my pool for community swim lessons, I would not be thrilled about it. Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That is not really the same thing, Martin. A pool is clearly personal property. Natural resources are different. They affect the entire community's environment and property values. They are still on my deed, I said firmly. Look, I understand wanting to build community spirit, but this is not the way. If people want to learn woodworking, I would be happy to recommend some classes in Denver. If the HOA wants wooden benches for the park, I could even offer to build some at a reasonable rate, but I am not turning over my timber rights. Patricia set down her pen with a soft click that somehow sounded ominous. I see. Well, I am disappointed, Grant. I had hoped you would be more community-minded. I think we need to table this discussion for now and revisit it at next month's meeting. In the meantime, I would encourage you to reconsider your position. Trevor, would you please note that Mr. Hughes has declined to cooperate with the proposed community resource sharing program? Trevor scribbled something on his notepad, avoiding eye contact with me. The meeting wrapped up shortly after. As people filed out, a few gave me sympathetic looks, but no one said anything. Tom caught my eye and gave a small shake of his head, as if to say I had just made a huge mistake. Patricia gathered her papers slowly, deliberately making me wait. When the room was nearly empty, she approached me with that same frozen smile. I really wish you had been more flexible, she said quietly. Things are going to be much harder now. Is that a threat? I asked. It is a reality, she replied. You have made it clear you do not value being part of this community. The board will have to respond accordingly. We have rules here, Grant, standards, and we have ways of ensuring everyone complies. She left before I could respond, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor with sharp, precise strikes. The harassment started 3 days later. I came home from a supply run to Denver to find a violation notice taped to my door. According to the notice, my grass exceeded the maximum allowed height of 3 inches. I walked around my yard, measuring with a tape measure. The grass was, at most, 3¼ inches tall. I had literally mowed 4 days ago. The fine was $250, due within 10 days or subject to additional penalties. I called the number on the notice and got Patricia's voicemail. "This is regarding the grass height violation," I said after the beep. "I measured and the grass is barely over the limit. I just mowed a few days ago. Can we discuss this reasonably?" She called back an hour later. "Mr. Hughes, the violation stands. Our inspector measured multiple areas exceeding the limit. If you believe the citation was issued in error, you can file an appeal with the board, but you will need to do so in writing within 5 business days, and there is a $100 appeal filing fee." "This is ridiculous," I said. "No, this is community standards," she replied coolly. "I would suggest you mow your lawn more frequently. And please make sure you use the approved grass height. 3 inches means 3 inches, not 3¼ Precision matters." She hung up. I mowed the lawn that afternoon, setting the mower to its lowest setting. Then I sat down and drafted an appeal letter, laying out the timeline and my measurements. I attached photos with a ruler for scale. I drove to Patricia's house to deliver it personally, along with a check for the ridiculous filing fee. She took the envelope without inviting me in. "The board will review this at next month's meeting." "Next month? The fine is due in 10 days. "Yes. If you want to avoid additional penalties, I would suggest paying the original fine. If your appeal is successful, you will be refunded. That is our standard procedure." I paid the original fine, knowing that fighting it would cost more in time and stress than the money was worth. But I documented everything: photos, measurements, dates, times. If this was going to be a war of attrition, I was going to keep records. The next violation came a week later. Apparently, my workshop door was the wrong color. The exterior doors had to be either forest green, colonial red, or harvest gold, according to the architectural guidelines. My workshop door was dark brown, the same color it had been when I bought the place. I pulled out the photos from my real estate listing. The door was clearly visible in several shots, definitely brown. I called Patricia again. "The previous owner had a variance," she explained with exaggerated patience. "Those variances do not automatically transfer to new owners. You need to apply for a new variance or repaint the door to an approved color." Why was not I informed of this when I moved in? Property owners are responsible for knowing and complying with HOA regulations. Ignorance is not an excuse. The fine was $500. The cost to repaint the door was about $100. I repainted it forest green and paid the fine, my resentment building with every brushstroke. Tom stopped by while I was painting. "She is really going after you, huh?" "It is insane," I said, dipping my brush with more force than necessary. "These are obviously retaliatory." "Of course they are. That is what she does. Guy down on Maple Street got hit with 17 violations in 3 months because he complained about the HOA raising dues. He ended up paying over $4,000 in fines before he just gave up." "Did not he fight back?" "Sue tried to. But the HOA bylaws give the board a lot of discretion on enforcement, and fighting them in court costs tens of thousands. Most people cannot afford it, and she knows that." It is a war of attrition, and she has deeper pockets because she is spending HOA money, not her own. I finished the door, staring at the green paint with disgust. There has to be a way to push back. Tom shrugged. If you find it, let me know. Most of us just try to stay invisible. But staying invisible was not in my nature. And besides, Patricia clearly was not going to let me fade into the background. Over the next month, I received violations for parking my truck at a slight angle in my driveway, improper vehicle positioning, having my garbage cans visible from the street 4 hours past the pickup time. They had been delayed that day, and installing a motion sensor light on my workshop without architectural approval, even though the previous owner had installed it years ago. Each violation came with escalating fines. Each appeal was denied. I was hemorrhaging money, but more than that, I was being driven crazy by the constant harassment. Every time I came home, I checked for new notices. Every time my phone rang, I wondered if it was Patricia with some new complaint. The stress was affecting my work, my sleep, my entire quality of life, and I still had not cut a single tree. I was beginning to understand Patricia's strategy. She was not going to directly take my trees. She was going to make my life so miserable that I would either give in to her demands or sell the house and leave. Either way, she won. I was sitting in my workshop one evening, trying to focus on a cherry wood side table I was building for a client, when I heard a vehicle coming up my driveway. I looked out to see a luxury SUV parking near my house. Patricia climbed out along with a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. I met them at my front door. "Can I help you?" "Good evening, Grant," Patricia said with false warmth. "This is Howard Stevens, the HOA's attorney. We wanted to have a conversation with you about resolving our ongoing issues." I looked at the lawyer, who gave me a professional smile that did not reach his eyes. "This seems excessive for a neighborly chat." "Mr. Hughes," Howard began, his voice smooth and practiced, "my client has informed me that there have been ongoing compliance issues with your property. Additionally, there is the matter of the community resource sharing proposal that you rejected. We believe we can reach an amicable solution if everyone is willing to be reasonable." "Come in," I said, deciding I wanted witnesses to whatever they were about to propose. I texted Tom to come over if he could, using a prearranged signal we had set up. We sat in my living room, Patricia and Howard on my couch, me in the armchair across from them. Tom arrived a few minutes later, and I introduced him as a friend who was advising me. Howard pulled out several documents from his briefcase. First, regarding the violations. The HOA is prepared to forgive all outstanding fines, which currently total approximately $3,200, if you agree to certain terms. "What terms?" I asked warily. "You would agree to grant the HOA a timber easement on your property," he said, sliding a document across the coffee table. "This would allow the community woodworking program to proceed. You would retain ownership of the land, but the HOA would have rights to harvest up to 30% of the standing timber annually, with harvesting decisions made by an HOA-appointed forestry committee." I did not even need to read the document. 30%. That is insane. That would devastate the forest. Sustainable harvesting is maybe 5 to 10% annually at most, and that is with careful selection and rotation. "The percentage is negotiable," Patricia interjected. "We could discuss 20%. The percentage should be 0%, I said flatly. "Because this is my property, and you have no legal right to it." Howard's expression did not change. "Actually, Mr. Hughes, the legal situation is more complex than you might think. The HOA bylaws do grant certain rights regarding community resources, and a court might interpret that to include natural resources on private property that affect the community's environmental quality. Might, I repeated. You do not even sound confident about that. Litigation is expensive and unpredictable, he continued smoothly. Even if you ultimately prevailed, you would spend years in court and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. The HOA has considerable resources for a protracted legal battle. Do you? There it was, the naked threat. Tom shifted beside me, his jaw tight. And if I refuse your generous offer? I asked. Patricia leaned forward. Then the HOA will have no choice but to continue enforcing community standards rigorously. We will also explore our legal options regarding the timber easement. Howard believes we have a strong case. I believe you have a possible case, Howard corrected mildly. Strong is perhaps overstating it. Patricia shot him an annoyed look but continued. The point is, Grant, you have a choice. You can work with us and be part of this community, or you can fight us and make yourself miserable. I know which option I would choose. I looked at Tom, who gave me a subtle shake of his head. Then I looked back at Patricia and Howard. I need time to think about this and consult with my own attorney. Of course, Howard said, standing. Take a week, but I would encourage you not to delay too long. The HOA board meets in 10 days and they will need to make decisions about how to proceed. After they left, Tom let out a long breath. Man, they are really coming for you. I know. I picked up the document Howard had left, skimming through pages of dense legal language. Can they actually do this? Can an HOA just take timber rights? I have no idea, but I would not put it past Patricia to try. She has been expanding the HOA's power for years, and no one has really stopped her. Tom paused. What are you going to do? I set down the document and walked to my back window, looking out at the forest that had brought me here. The late afternoon sun filtered through the branches, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. I had spent months dreaming about working with this wood, planning which trees to harvest, imagining the furniture I could create. The thought of letting Patricia turn it into some amateur craft project made me physically ill. I am going to fight, I said quietly, but not the way she expects. The next morning, I drove to Denver and met with Sarah Martinez, a real estate attorney who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed and direct in a way I immediately appreciated. After I explained the situation, she leaned back in her chair and frowned. They are pushing hard. The timber easement claim is legally shaky at best. HOA bylaws can govern use of property to some extent, but they cannot just appropriate private property for community use without compensation. That would likely be considered a taking, which requires due process and fair payment. So I can fight this. You can, but it will be expensive and time-consuming, like they said. HOA litigation is brutal because they have the advantage of using member dues to fund their legal efforts. You are on your own. She tapped her pen on her desk. The violation harassment is also problematic but hard to prove as retaliatory unless we can establish a clear pattern. Do you have documentation? I pulled out my folder of photos, measurements, timelines, and violation notices. She spent 20 minutes reviewing everything, her frown deepening. This is good. This is very good. You have been thorough. She looked up at me. If you want to pursue this legally, I would be happy to represent you. I would estimate we are looking at $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees minimum, probably more if it goes to trial, and it could take a year or more to resolve. My stomach sank. I had savings, but that would wipe out a significant portion. What are my other options? You could accept their offer, negotiate better terms for the timber easement. Not happening. She smiled slightly. I did not think so. The other option is to get creative. HOAs have power, but they are not invincible. They depend on member compliance and participation. If you can turn the community against the board, or at least create enough controversy that they back off, you might be able to win without litigation. How would I do that? Information. Transparency. Most HOA members do not pay attention to what the board does until it affects them personally. If you can show them that the board is overreaching, wasting money, abusing power, you might be able to force a board election or a bylaw change. She paused. Of course, that is also a long game, and there is no guarantee it will work. I left her office with a lot to think about and a retainer agreement I had not yet signed. The legal route was daunting, but Sarah's other suggestion had planted an idea in my mind. That evening, I started researching the HOA's finances. As a member, I had a right to request financial records. I sent a formal written request to Patricia, citing the specific bylaw that granted me that access. Her response came 3 days later, delivered by email. The HOA would provide the requested documents within 30 days, as required by law, but there would be a reasonable administrative fee of $500 to cover the cost of compiling and copying the records. I called Sarah. Can she really charge me $500 for records I have a legal right to see? Probably not. Reasonable fees for copying are usually just that the actual cost of making copies, maybe a few dollars per page. $500 is excessive unless we are talking about thousands of pages. You could fight it, but that means more legal fees. I paid the $500 and waited. 29 days later, a box arrived on my doorstep containing 3 years of financial records. I spent a week going through them, cross-referencing expenses, checking invoices, tracking payments. What I found was eye-opening. Patricia had been funneling HOA money to various consultants and contractors, many of whom appeared to be connected to her personal business ventures. The HOA had paid over $60,000 to a landscape consulting firm that, when I researched it, turned out to be partially owned by Patricia's husband. Another $40,000 had gone to a community development advisor, whose business address was a P.O. box. It was not quite embezzlement. The payments were documented and approved by the board, but it smelled like corruption. Patricia was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank, approving inflated contracts to companies she had connections with. I made copies of everything and organized it into a clear, documented report. Then, I did something Patricia probably did not expect. I started attending every HOA meeting and asking questions. At the next monthly meeting, I raised my hand during the financial report. I have a question about the landscape consulting contract. What exactly did we receive for $60,000? Patricia's expression hardened. That is an ongoing contract for planning and advisory services. Can you be more specific? What deliverables have we received? Trevor, the treasurer, shuffled his papers nervously. Well, there have been various reports and recommendations. Can residents review those reports? I asked. They are working documents, Patricia said sharply, not for general distribution. But we paid for them with HOA funds. Shouldn't members have access? Several other residents looked up from their phones, suddenly interested. Patricia's jaw tightened. If you have specific concerns, Mr. Hughes, you can submit them in writing. We are not going to derail this meeting with an inquisition. I backed off, but I had made my point. Other people were starting to pay attention. Over the next several weeks, I kept up the pressure. I submitted written questions before each meeting, requiring Patricia to address them publicly. I requested additional financial records. I started talking to other residents, sharing what I had found, building a coalition of people who were tired of Patricia's rule. The turning point came when I discovered that Patricia had approved a $20,000 contract to repaint the community center, a building that had been painted just 18 months earlier. The contractor was, once again, connected to her husband's business. I brought this up at the next meeting, and this time, other residents joined in with their own questions. The room got heated, with Patricia trying to shut down discussion and residents demanding answers. Finally, a woman named Jennifer, who lived on the street behind mine, stood up. "I move that we call for an audit of the HOA finances by an independent accounting firm," she said loudly. "Second," Tom called out immediately. Patricia's face went red. "That is not on the agenda." "It does not have to be," Jennifer shot back. "Any member can make a motion and the board has to vote on it. That is in the bylaws, Section 6. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Howard, the attorney, leaned over and whispered something to her. She nodded stiffly. "Fine. We will take a vote. All in favor." Nearly every hand in the room went up. Patricia, Trevor, and Carol were the only ones opposed. "The motion passes," Patricia said through gritted teeth. "We will arrange for an audit, but here is where I made a tactical error. I got so focused on the financial fight that I took my eye off the timber issue. I should have realized Patricia would not just sit back and wait for the audit results. 2 weeks later, I was in Denver meeting with a client when I got a call from Tom. "Grant, you need to get home. Now." "What is wrong?" "There are people on your property. They are cutting down your trees." I broke every speed limit getting back to Maplewood Springs. When I pulled up to my house, I saw 2 pickup trucks parked on the edge of my property, and I could hear the whine of chainsaws coming from the woods. I ran toward the sound, my heart pounding. 3 men were in the process of felling a massive oak tree, one of the specimens I had been planning to harvest myself in a few years. 2 other trees were already down, their trunks being cut into sections. "Hey," I shouted. "What the hell are you doing?" The men stopped, looking at me in confusion. One of them, a heavy-set guy with a graying beard, stepped forward. "We are with Timberline Forestry Services. We have a work order to harvest timber." "From who?" He pulled out a sheet of paper. "The Maplewood Springs HOA. They contracted us to begin selective harvesting for the community woodworking program." My vision literally went red around the edges. "This is my property. I never authorized this." The foreman frowned, looking at the paper again. "The work order says we have HOA approval." "Are you saying they did not have authority to contract this work?" "That is exactly what I am saying. This is private property and you are trespassing. You need to leave immediately, or I am calling the police." The men looked at each other uncertainly. "Look, buddy, we are just contractors doing a job. If there is a dispute about authorization, you need to take that up with whoever hired us. We are not going to get in the middle of it. You are already in the middle of it. You have cut down my trees without my permission. That is destruction of property." The foreman's expression turned worried. "We had no idea there was a question about authorization. The HOA told us everything was cleared." He pulled out his phone. "Let me call my boss." While he made the call, I walked over to examine the damage. The oak they had been working on was about halfway through the cut, the chainsaw wedged in the trunk. 2 other trees, a beautiful walnut and another oak, were already down. I felt sick looking at them. These were 50, 60-year-old trees, destroyed in an afternoon because Patricia Henderson could not stand to lose. The foreman came back over. "My boss says we need to suspend work until this gets sorted out. He is going to contact the HOA and find out what is going on." "Good. And tell him I will be documenting all of this for my attorney." The crew packed up their equipment and left, looking uncomfortable and annoyed. I spent the next hour photographing everything: the fallen trees, the cut marks, the tire tracks, everything. Then I called Sarah Martinez. They did what? She said when I explained. They contracted a forestry company to start cutting my trees without my authorization. That is so far over the line it is almost funny. Almost. This is clearly illegal. You could press criminal charges for trespassing and destruction of property, and you definitely have grounds for a civil suit. She paused. But Grant, I have to be honest, this actually might be good for you. Good. They destroyed 3 of my trees. I know, and I am sorry. But this is the kind of egregious overreach that a court will not tolerate. The HOA just handed you leverage. If you play this right, you can probably force a settlement that protects your property and holds them accountable. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report. A deputy came out to my property, took statements, and photographed the damage. He explained that property disputes involving HOAs were usually civil matters, but that the unauthorized tree cutting could potentially be criminal trespass and destruction of property. He said he would forward the report to the district attorney's office. Then I drafted a letter to the HOA board, via Sarah's office, demanding that they immediately cease any and all actions regarding my timber, pay for the damages, which I calculated at approximately $12,000 based on the value of the lumber, and formally rescind any claims to timber rights on my property. I gave them 10 days to respond. Patricia's response came within 2 days, through Howard Stevens. The HOA denied any wrongdoing, claiming they had been acting within their authority as outlined in the bylaws. They offered to pay for the damage to the trees at a valuation of $300 per tree, which was insulting. They also doubled down on their claim to a timber easement, threatening to file a lawsuit to establish their rights. They are bluffing, Sarah said when I showed her the letter. Or at least they are overplaying their hand. No judge is going to side with them on this, but they are betting you will not want to go through a trial. Then they are betting wrong, I said. We filed a lawsuit against the HOA for trespass, destruction of property, and harassment. We also filed for an emergency injunction to prevent them from taking any further action regarding my trees. The judge granted the injunction within a week, ordering the HOA to stay off my property and cease any timber-related activities pending trial. The lawsuit made the local news. Suddenly, people outside the neighborhood were paying attention to what was happening in Maplewood Springs. A reporter from a Denver news station came out and interviewed me, and the story aired on the evening news. Homeowner battles HOA over tree rights. The coverage was not flattering to Patricia and the board. The audit results came back around the same time, and they were damning. The independent accounting firm found multiple instances of questionable payments, inadequate documentation, and potential conflicts of interest. The report stopped short of calling it fraud, but it strongly recommended a complete overhaul of the HOA's financial procedures and suggested that certain contracts should be investigated further. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed. Residents who had not attended in years showed up, angry and demanding answers. Patricia tried to maintain control, but the mood was hostile. Jennifer stood up again. I move that we remove the current board and hold emergency elections. The motion passed almost unanimously. Patricia, Trevor, and Carol were voted out on the spot. An interim board was established with Tom as president, Jennifer as vice president, and 3 other long-time residents filling out the positions. Patricia did not go quietly. "This is a farce," she shouted as people voted. "You are all making a huge mistake. This neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership. We will take our chances," Tom said calmly. Patricia stormed out, threatening legal action, but everyone knew it was over. Without the HOA backing her, she had no leverage. The new board's first action was to settle with me. They formally apologized for the unauthorized tree cutting, agreed to pay full damages of $12,000, and explicitly acknowledged my complete and exclusive rights to the timber on my property. They also revised the bylaws to clarify that community resources referred only to common areas, not private property. The district attorney's office decided not to press criminal charges, determining that the matter had been resolved civilly and that Patricia's actions, while wrong, did not rise to the level of criminal intent. I was not entirely happy with that decision, but I was tired of fighting. Patricia and her husband sold their house 3 months later and moved out of state. The landscape consulting firm and the various other connected contractors quietly lost their HOA contracts. The new board hired a property management company to handle day-to-day operations, bringing professionalism and transparency to the HOA's finances. As for me, I finally got to start working with my trees. I developed a careful 20-year harvest rotation plan, taking only mature trees that were ready and replanting in their place. I marked the areas where the forestry company had cut down my trees and turned those logs into a series of memorial pieces: a dining table, 2 benches, and a decorative screen. I kept one bench for myself and sold the others, donating the proceeds to a local forestry conservation nonprofit. The irony was that I did end up sharing some of my wood with the community, just not the way Patricia had envisioned. I started teaching a woodworking class twice a month in my workshop for interested neighbors. I charged a small fee to cover materials, and I provided lumber from my property for the projects. It was sustainable, controlled, and respectful of both the craft and the resource. Tom was one of my regular students. We were working on a cherry wood jewelry box one afternoon when he brought up the whole saga. "You know, you could have just given her a few trees and avoided all that drama," he said, sanding a dovetail joint. "I could have," I agreed, "but then she would have just kept pushing." People like Patricia do not stop when you give in. They see it as weakness and push harder. "True, but you took a huge risk. You could have lost everything." "Maybe, but some things are worth fighting for." I ran my hand along a piece of walnut I was planing, feeling the grain beneath my fingers. This land, these trees, this work, it is not just about money or property rights. It is about principle. It is about not letting bullies win just because fighting back is hard. Tom nodded slowly. "Well, for what it is worth, I am glad you did fight. The HOA is better now. The whole neighborhood is better. We actually have a functioning community instead of Patricia's personal kingdom." That was true. The new board had implemented regular open forums where residents could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. They had negotiated better contracts for services, saving the HOA money while improving quality. They had even organized some genuinely community-building events: movie nights in the park, a neighborhood barbecue, a winter festival, and the community woodworking program. It happened, but in a completely different form. The HOA purchased a small plot of land at the edge of the neighborhood and planted fast-growing trees specifically for community use. In about 10 years, those trees would be ready for harvest, and residents would be able to use that lumber for projects. In the meantime, the HOA partnered with a local lumber supplier who gave residents a discount on materials. It was a sensible, legal, ethical solution that actually served the community instead of just serving Patricia's desire for control. I still live in Maplewood Springs, and I still love my 5 acres of forest. Every time I select a tree for harvest, I think about that moment when I came home and saw strangers cutting down my oaks. The anger has faded, replaced by a deep appreciation for what I have and what I fought to protect. The case did set a legal precedent, at least locally. Sarah told me that other attorneys now cite my lawsuit in HOA disputes, using it as an example of the limits of HOA authority. She said I probably helped a lot of other homeowners who were dealing with overreaching boards. I finished another piece last week, a desk made from one of the walnut trees I had been planning to harvest when I first moved here. The grain was spectacular, swirling patterns of dark and light that looked like flowing water. I took photos and posted them on my website, and within a day, I had 3 inquiries from potential clients. One of the inquiries was from someone in Maplewood Springs, a new resident who had just moved in and was looking for custom furniture. We met at my workshop, and as I showed him examples of my work, he mentioned that he had heard about me before moving in. "The real estate agent told me about the whole HOA thing," he said. "She said you were the guy who stood up to the crazy board president." Honestly, that made me more interested in the neighborhood. I liked knowing that people here were not going to just roll over for petty tyrants. I had to laugh at that. "Well, I hope your experience with the current HOA is boring and uneventful." "So far so good," he said, running his hand along the walnut desk. "This is beautiful work. How much?" We talked about pricing and design options, and he ended up commissioning a matching desk and bookshelf set. As he left, he turned back. "Thanks for fighting, by the way. I know it probably cost you a lot of time and money, but it mattered." After he left, I sat in my workshop for a while, just thinking. The whole experience had cost me about $18,000 in legal fees, fines, and damages money I would never get back despite the settlement. It had cost me months of stress, countless hours of work, and more than a few sleepless nights. There were times during the fight when I wondered if it was worth it, if I should have just sold the house and moved somewhere without an HOA. But sitting there in my workshop, surrounded by lumber from my own land, knowing that I had protected something important and maybe helped others in the process, I realized I would make the same choice again. Some fights choose you, and when they do, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. You can give in, compromise your principles, let the bullies win. Or you can stand up, fight back, and accept the cost. I chose to fight, and I won. Not just the legal battle, but something more important. I won the right to live on my own terms, to do my work without interference, to be part of a community without surrendering my autonomy. That was worth every penny, every sleepless night, every moment of stress. The sun was setting through my workshop windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I had a commissioned rocking chair to finish, and I was eager to get back to work. I selected a piece of oak from my carefully organized lumber, rack wood from a tree I had harvested last fall, properly dried and seasoned, and carried it to my workbench. As I began to work, I thought about how different things could have been. If I had given Patricia those trees, I would be sitting here with less lumber, less control, and a lot less self-respect. I would have set a precedent that my property was not really mine, that community demands trumped individual rights. And Patricia would have moved on to her next target, emboldened by my capitulation. Instead, I had drawn a line. I had said no, and I had backed it up with action. The consequences rippled beyond just my property. The HOA was reformed, the board was changed, the bylaws were improved. Other residents felt empowered to speak up about their concerns. The neighborhood became more democratic, more transparent, more genuinely community-oriented, and I got to keep my trees, all of them. Every oak, every walnut, every maple and ash and cherry. They grew on my land, nourished by my soil, protected by my refusal to surrender. When I harvested them, it was on my timeline, according to my plan, respecting the forest's natural rhythms and ensuring its sustainability for decades to come. The wood in my hands felt different now, somehow. It was not just lumber. It was a symbol of something larger: the importance of standing up for yourself, the value of principles, the power of ordinary people to resist unreasonable authority. Every piece of furniture I built from these trees carried that story with it. Every client who received one of my pieces was taking home a small piece of that victory. I worked late into the evening, shaping and sanding, letting my hands remember the movements they had learned over years of practice. The rocking chair was for a young couple expecting their first child. They wanted something that would last generations, something with history and meaning. I was giving them that, crafted from trees that had stood for decades and would now serve a new purpose, connecting past to future. Around midnight, I finally turned off the lights and locked up the workshop. Walking back to my house, I looked up at the stars, bright and clear in the Colorado sky, unobscured by city lights. In the darkness, I could hear the wind moving through the forest, the trees swaying and creaking, alive and strong. Tomorrow, I would be back at work. I had commissions to finish, clients to consult with, wood to harvest and season. I had a class to teach next week, and Tom had mentioned wanting to learn about steam bending techniques. Life was full and busy, and exactly what I wanted it to be. Patricia was gone, the HOA was reformed, and my forest stood intact. In the end, that was all that mattered. I had fought for what was mine, and I had won. Not because I was smarter or richer or more powerful than my opponents, but because I refused to give up. I refused to let someone else dictate how I lived my life and used my property. The house was quiet when I entered, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the anxious silence of waiting for the next violation notice. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on my back deck, looking out at the dark shapes of the trees against the night sky. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the trees that stood, to the battles fought and won, to the principle that private property means something, and to the stubborn refusal to let bullies win. Then I drank, savoring the burn and the warmth, feeling satisfied and complete in a way I had not felt in months. The fight was over. I had my land, my trees, my livelihood, and my peace. And Patricia Henderson had learned a valuable lesson. Some people will not be pushed around, no matter how hard you push. Some people will fight back, and when they do, you better be ready for the consequences. I finished my bourbon and went inside to sleep, comfortable in my own home on my own land, surrounded by my own forest. And in the morning, I would wake up and do it all again: the woodworking, the harvesting, the building, the teaching. The life I had chosen, protected, and earned. That was victory. Not just winning the legal battle, but winning the right to live authentically, to work with purpose, and to stand on principle. Patricia had demanded I share my wood, and she had frozen in shock when I cut off her access entirely, not just to the wood, but to the power she had wielded so casually for so long. In the end, the wood remained mine, the forest remained intact, and the community became stronger for having confronted and overcome a tyrant in their midst. And I remained in my home, in my workshop, doing the work I loved with materials I had fought to protect. Some would say I should have compromised, that the conflict was not worth the cost. But those people had never stood in a forest they owned, looking at trees they had planned to harvest, only to find strangers cutting them down. They had never felt that violation, that theft, that absolute disregard for their rights and autonomy. I had felt it, and I had responded. And now, every time I walked into my workshop or looked out at my forest, I felt not just ownership but pride. Pride in standing up, in fighting back, in refusing to be bullied. That pride would last longer than any piece of furniture I built, any tree I harvested, any commission I completed. It was worth it. Every penny, every hour, every moment of stress and fear and anger. It was all worth it, because I had won the thing that mattered most. The right to be myself on my own land, living my own life. And nobody, not Patricia Henderson, not the HOA, not anyone could take that away from me. The story could have ended differently. I could have given in, shared my wood, accepted Patricia's authority. My life would have been easier in some ways, certainly less stressful and expensive. But it also would have been smaller, diminished, marked by compromise and surrender. I would have looked at my forest and seen Patricia's victory, not my own property. I would have worked with my wood knowing it was there on sufferance, not by right. Instead, I looked at my forest and saw my victory. I worked with my wood knowing it was mine, absolutely and without question. And that made all the difference. That made every sacrifice worthwhile. That made me wake up each morning grateful and satisfied, ready to do the work I loved in the place I had chosen and defended. Patricia had demanded I share my wood. I had refused. She had frozen when I cut off all access, not just to the wood, but to the power she had built over years of bullying and intimidation. And in that moment of her shock and defeat, I had won more than a legal battle. I had won the right to my own life, and that was the greatest victory of all.